Hi everyone, my name's Joey O'Donnell. I'm a junior undergrad at Case, and I just wanted to share a little bit for this Black History Month about how my journey towards becoming somebody who's anti-racist has been, and I wanted to share some of the thoughts that I've had from a class that I took this January. And I wanted to couch all of this in the idea of what it's like to be anti-racist when you're a white male, right? When you're not somebody who's had these kinds of experiences of oppression, how can I constructively counteract something that I've never really seen? And I found that the best way to interpret this is through a lens of humility. So I wanted to share some of my thoughts. First thing about humility, becoming anti-racist often requires you to acknowledge that you've made mistakes. It certainly required me to acknowledge that I've made mistakes, right? And those can be very painful. Realizing that things that you didn't believe at the time were harmful did have an impact on other people has been a painful process. And it's these bumps along the way are discouraging. But if we think about this through this lens of humility, I have to admit that I don't know everything. And I think that's what's really painful about trying to become anti-racist. And it's why it's something I was personally very recalcitrant to do at first. 'Cause I thought I knew this, right? Like I'm fine. I'm not hurting anyone. I certainly don't feel like I am. And recognizing that things I've done in the past are things I shouldn't have said or shouldn't have done is painful, but it's something that I'm learning through. And I think bringing humility to the fore here can help quite a bit. The arrogance of personalism. We talk in our class about personalism as a way of thinking about language where the meaning of an utterance is really based on the intent of the speaker. So when it comes to racism, the idea is that you obsess over the intent of the speaker at any given time, rather than focusing on the impact that those words had on people that they are offensive against. And I think this is a profoundly arrogant person, excuse me, profoundly arrogant ideology. Because one, I have to be able to claim to know that I know why somebody said what they said at that time. Number two, I have to be able to say that this represents this person's entire being, not just a moment. Number three, I have to act that even if I could do that, that I've solved the problem and that I've done something. And I think looking beyond this personalist obsession with intent over impact requires me to think for a second. I can't really do either of these things and be effective. I'm not as powerful as I thought, and that requires humility. The long haul, when I think about this in the long term, there's a couple lessons that I've come away with, and I just have some rhetorical questions on the slide. The first is that I'm not the arbiter of what is offensive and what isn't. And unless I'm approaching this from a perspective of humility, that can be quite difficult. And I have to realize not only that I'm not the person in charge, but that people whom I'm not used to listening to, not because of necessarily they're being stupid or otherwise incapable, but just because of the way society has worked, I'll have to learn from people who may be completely underrepresented in the people who have been my teachers, who have been my coaches, right? Um, the people who are victims of oppression and know about this stuff. I have to accept that I'm not the person who's in charge. I have to accept that my experience isn't the only one that matters. And a story that I use to illustrate this point is whenever I have difficulty pronouncing a name and I have the ability to call on anyone in a class or meeting or anything like that, I'll almost always reserve calling on the people who have difficult to pronounce names because I don't want to appear ignorant. And if my experience is the only one that matters, then that makes a lot of sense. But looking at it from the perspective of the person who never gets called on voluntarily because of the name, it's one of those things where if I decenter for myself, it becomes quite clear that it's worth a little bit of pain for me to try to overcome that. And the hardest part for me in the long term is realizing that people who are on the same journey I am, and I'm certainly not done, I'm not even close, that people who are on the same journey as I am aren't just lost causes. We talk about this folk theory in this class where racism is a reflection of real categories and it's the practice of only a few ignorant people. And it's so easy to write off people who make mistakes or maybe even are maliciously racist as just complete lost causes. And while it's certainly satisfying, it makes me feel great. I have to dig a little deeper if I want to solve the problem and help people come to these kinds of realizations and allow myself to be helped. And I think that's the hardest one because it is very easy to make myself appear virtuous on the backs of others. So again, just thinking about humility, my overall perspective on all this is that there will be bumps in the road. I won't My experience won't always be great, but that kind of cognitive and conscious effort is what's going to make this progress happen. The analogy I use is, middle school social mishaps. We all have them. Very few of us like to name them. I won't name mine. But what feels like a horrible mistake now was ultimately an instrumental part of the progress I've made as a person to this point and will continue to be in the future. Um, these are lessons about me as a work in progress, not indictments of who I am. And that requires some humility to realize I'm not necessarily at my end point and I have some development left to do. So, in conclusion, I talked a lot about how racism has been a hard topic for me, but I want to recalibrate that a little bit just to make sure that I'm making this clear that the victims of oppression are going through a little bit more than my little ask of humility. And to illustrate this, I took this quote from the Green Book, which I learned about in this class. And the idea is that this is a travel guide for Black travelers so that they know where they can stop without being harassed on the basis of their skin color. And I won't read this all out loud, but imagining not being able to stop everywhere, imagining being at risk from law enforcement, imagining being uncomfortable in a Walmart or any retail store. These things are a lot more than anything I've had to deal with, and I certainly don't want to come across as though I've climbed some great mountain. I think this is ultimately one of the most important aspects of this humility. So, when I think about being anti-racist, I think of myself as a work in progress, and I have a lot left to do. But as long as I can take the spotlight off of myself for a moment, I think that is how I can help dismantle these systems of oppression. So, thanks for hearing me out, and I hope you all have a great day.